Good evening to everybody here with us in person in Jerusalem. Good afternoon to those watching in the United States, in Zoom, and elsewhere in the world, of course. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, and part of my responsibilities here are organizing the events for English speakers and other content and programming that we do in English. We typically have events here both in person and also on Zoom, webinars on Zoom, that focus on a lot of contemporary events. You'll be aware that there's a lot of contemporary events to talk about in this region, including in the last few hours. You may be aware. Those not aware should just Google Qatar Hamas and see what smile it brings to your face. But of course, the Jewish people have been there's an awful lot of historical consequence in the long story of the Jewish people, and it's not every day that we get the opportunity to welcome a visiting historian who's really at the top of his field and has written a book of such, I think, interest and consequence for not for the Jewish people and for Israel. 6 weeks ago or so, we marked the fast of Tisha B'Av, when our attention was very much focused on at least in part, on the events of the year 70 CE, destruction of the Second Temple, the revolt around that, and there's a lot was here at the Begin Center. In fact, we had a day of learning where we heard from Jewish educators with a particular Jewish and religious angle, talking about what happened then. But of course, the historical angle is something not just of equal interest and importance, but also I think something that many of us haven't had the opportunity to learn as much about, certainly as much as we should. And there's really an amazing amount of new information, certainly new for me, and I suspect new for other people as well, in the book that we're going to be discussing, the book by Professor Bryce Strauss, who's visiting us from California, the Corliss Page Dean Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, the Bryce and Edith M. Bowmar Professor in Humanistic Studies Emeritus at Cornell University, and one of the leading experts for ancient military history. He's written and edited several books, including The Battle of Salamis, The Trojan War, The Spartacus War, Masters of Command, The Death of Caesar, and 10 Caesars, and his latest book we're going to be discussing is Jews versus Rome. Unfortunately, we were not able to get copies here to sell here tonight. You should turn to our friends at Amazon and order yourselves copies. It's a really extraordinary and enlightening read. So I'm going to invite Professor Strauss to address us this evening. Then I'm going to ask him some questions myself, and then turn the floor to you to ask your questions of him. So, Professor Bryce.
Thank you. That very generous introduction, Paul. Thank you all for coming this evening. I see some friends, I see some family, and I see some new faces, so delighted. So it's an honor to speak here in this city where so much of our history takes place, so much of what I wrote about in this book takes place, or which was the aspiration of so many of the people that I wrote about in the book. And an honor to be here at the Menachem Begin Center, named after one of Israel's great leaders. So I wrote this book, Jews versus Rome, 2 centuries of rebellion against the world's mightiest empire. And I wrote about 3 revolts, Jewish revolts against Rome. Other people have done so as well, although most people who write about it focus on the first revolt, the Great Revolt, the revolt known because of by Josephus, the Jewish War, but also because of its most famous event, Masada, which is so symbolic of Israel and Jewish history. But there are two other revolts as well. The Great Revolt took place between 66 and 70 CE, with Masada following. Now it looks most likely that it happened in 74, though it could have happened in 73, we're not sure. And then there was the Bar Kokhba Revolt, also quite well known. That would be dated between 132 and 136 CE. But in between, there was a third revolt that's not so well known. It's called either the Diaspora Revolt or sometimes called the Quitos War. We used to date it from between 115 to 117 CE, but more recently it's been redated, I think convincingly, to 116, from 116 to 117. And that difference of a year makes a big difference. Let me just look at my watch because I'm supposed to speak for 20 minutes. Okay, good. Synchronize your watches and all that. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce you to four people, or actually two sets of individuals, two sets of people who were involved in these revolts. Maybe it's a bit of background. I don't know about you, but when I start a project, I always start with a thread. There's always something that intrigues me, that I want to know about, that has not usually been talked about in terms of this event. And that's my entree into it. So I wrote a book called The Death of Caesar. And anyone who's read Shakespeare or seen the great Hollywood movie knows something about the assassination of Julius Caesar, et tu, Brute, and all that. And I did too. But there are two things about it that I didn't know. One is that gladiators were involved. Since I'd written a book about Spartacus, a gladiator, before that, I thought, well, that's interesting. What do gladiators have to do with it? And two, even more interesting, was that Cleopatra was involved. I thought, really? There was no Cleopatra in Shakespeare. How was she involved? So those are the two threads that got me into writing a book and telling that story. In the case of the Jewish revolts, the thread that I followed and that got me interested was the Iranian connection. Now, I didn't start this project after October 7th, and I certainly didn't start it after the 12-Day War. I began thinking about it in 2020, when already, of course, the relationship between Iran and Israel was very much in our minds. But what I found so intriguing about this ancient history was that in ancient times, Iran and Israel weren't enemies. In fact, they were allies. In some cases, they were friends. In some cases, they coordinated their activities. In other cases, well, Israel then and now was a very small state located between much bigger and often more powerful states. And it had to make its way between empires. In antiquity, go back to ancient times, to the west was the Roman Empire, which of course conquered Israel, conquered Judea as it was known then. And to the east, there was the Parthian Empire, as the Iranian Empire was known at the time. But the Parthian Empire also conquered Judea. The Romans came in the year 63 BCE, infamously ending the experiment of independence that came from the Maccabees. And then barely 25 years later, the Parthians came. And they reinvaded Judea and reconquered it. And while the Romans put their guy on the throne, the Parthians came in, deposed him, and put their guy on the throne. And it was only 3 years after that that the Romans retook Judea and then put their guy on the throne, who lasted a long time. And that was King Herod, also known as Herod the Great. And that started the long period of Rome being the overlord and often the ruler of Judea. But the Parthians were always in the picture, and they were always in the imagination. They were always in the imagination of Jews in Judea, many of whom looked to Parthia for help against Rome, but it was also in the imagination of Rome, because as far as they were concerned, Parthia was the rival, the only empire on the horizon who could possibly compete with the Romans. And the Romans always looked to Parthia as a danger, as a threat, or a temptation for the Romans to invade, just as the Parthians had invaded Roman territory in the year 40 BCE. So what got me interested in this project was the Parthian connection. And that's a thread that I try to trace through these three revolts. And what I'll do now is talk about two sets of people that I think will tell us something about this Parthian connection. The first set comes from before and during the Great Revolt. Everyone's heard of Josephus, and everyone's heard of Titus. And maybe some of us have heard of Queen Helena. Probably few of us have heard of her kingdom, Adiabene, located in the equivalent of today's Iraqi Kurdistan in northern Iraq. And probably even fewer of us have heard of Tiberius Julius Alexander. Has anyone here heard of Tiberius Julius Alexander? Okay, got one winner. You get a copy of the book. Before I read the book. Okay. So Queen Helena and Tiberius Julius Alexander are kind of two ends of the seesaw. Tiberius Julius Alexander is a Jew who was a turncoat, who turned against the Jewish people and working for the Romans. Queen Helena was a Gentile who converted to Judaism, and her whole family converted to Judaism. The royal dynasty of Adiabene converted to Judaism. And they both were in Jerusalem in the decade of the 40s CE. Let me talk a little bit about Tiberius and then about Queen Helena. So Tiberius Julius Alexander comes from the first family of Jewish Alexandria. His father was a very prominent businessman, a very dedicated Jew. He donates 9 gold and silver doors to the temple in Jerusalem. His uncle is one of the most famous Jews of antiquity, Philo the philosopher, a man who tried to reconcile Judaism and Hellenism, and whose writings are still read today. Tiberius, as a young man, decided he wanted to throw his lot in with the Romans. He rises in the service of the Roman Empire. He is a governor of southern Egypt. After that, he rises in the Roman military. He's appointed governor of Judea, I believe in the year 40. So I think that his term's about 40 to 44 CE. I may be off by a year or two. And as governor of Judea, he wants to show the Romans that he is a reliable propagator of Roman rule. He's on the outlook for rebels because there have been small rebellions against Rome already in Judea. And he ends up punishing and crucifying 2 members of a family that prided themselves on their opposition to Rome. They're 2 members of the family that would ultimately give us the leader of Masada, Eleazar ben Yair. Tiberius Julius Alexander has them crucified. Around the same time, Queen Helena of Adiabene achieves her ambition, and she makes a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And she spends several years living in Jerusalem. There she builds a palace for her family. It's one of 3 families that palaces that the royal house of Adiabene builds. They're located probably on the Ophel. The archaeologists think they may have found one of them, but it's uncertain that it really is her palace or an Adiabenian palace. She spends a lot of time in the land of Israel. She comes to the rescue when there's a famine in Judea, and she imports foodstuffs from abroad to feed the suffering people. She's quite beloved by the people here. She eventually goes back to Adiabene, but she wants to be buried here. So she builds a tomb located where she is buried, and ultimately her sons are buried there as well. Located in East Jerusalem, you can still see it today. It's called the Tomb of the Kings, and it is property of La France. You have to apply to the French consulate. Am I right? You have to apply to the French consulate to see, I was lucky enough to be guided there. It's quite a remarkable tomb. Her family continues their association with Judea. They do business there. They are, so I should say that as rulers of Adiabene, Adiabene is a vassal kingdom that belongs to the Parthian Empire. Their overlord is the Parthian Emperor, and he sits in what is now southern Iraq. That's where the capital is. And there are a series of vassal kings in this loose confederation that makes up the Parthian Empire. And I'm sure it was of great interest to the Parthian king that one of his vassals has converted to Judaism and has these very useful connections in Judea. A musical interlude. No worries. I'll just wait for it to stop. Thank you. Okay. It's especially of interest because there's a large Jewish population in Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq. And there are close connections between many of the Jews there and the Jews of the land of Israel. As will have been obvious from what I said earlier, there's also a large Jewish population in Egypt, particularly in Alexandria, which is probably the largest Jewish city in terms of population in the world at the time. So on the one hand, we have this dynasty from Adiabene, making connections with the land of Israel, serving as a bridge between the Parthian king and the people of the Jewish people of Judea and further west. On the other hand, we have Tiberius Julius Alexander. So he serves as governor of Judea. We don't know much what his career takes him to in the decade between 2 decades about between 44 and 62. But in the year 62, he shows up in the far east of the Roman world. He shows up on the Parthian frontier. And he is an important person in the entourage of Rome's greatest general at the time, a man named Corbulo. The Romans and the Parthians are engaged in a cold war, which looks like it is about to become hot. The Parthians have humiliated a Roman army at a place called Randia. We don't know exactly where it is, somewhere in central or eastern Turkey. And the Romans send a new army under Corbulo to intimidate the Parthians in turn. And it works. The Parthians agree to, well, I wouldn't say surrender, but they agree to make a treaty with the Romans. At issue was control of Armenia. Armenia then is now as a country, it was larger in antiquity than it is now. It roughly consists of what is now Armenia and eastern Turkey. And the Parthians had asserted control of the royal house of Armenia. They put a younger member of the royal house of Armenia on the throne, royal house of Parthia, excuse me, on the throne of Armenia. The Romans accept this as long as the Parthians agree to send that king to Rome to do homage to the Roman Emperor Nero. And the man who negotiates the final agreement is none other than our friend Tiberius Julius Alexander. We read about this in the Roman historian Tacitus. And I forget exactly how he describes Tiberius, but Julius Alexander, but it makes it clear he is a very eminent Roman. He then goes on to something else. He becomes the governor of Egypt, very important Roman province. Ironically, Egypt, for what it is today, is one of the wealthiest places in the ancient world because of the fertility of the Nile River. And as governor of Egypt, he again shows the Romans that he is on their side and not on the side of his own people, because there is a series of riots in Alexandria, Jews versus Greeks. It gets quite violent, and Tiberius sends in the troops to defeat the Jews, massacre a lot of the Jews of Alexandria, and restore order. As striking as that is, and as ugly as it might seem, it's nothing compared to what comes next. Tiberius Julius Alexander then plays kingmaker in the war that follows the death of Nero, and then ends up putting Vespasian on the throne. And he is rewarded by given a plum military position. Vespasian, as you may know, is involved in subduing the first part of the Jewish revolt, great revolt against Rome, but then he goes back to Rome to take up his position as emperor. He turns it over to his son, Titus. He turns over the suppression of the revolt to Titus. Titus is only about 30 years old. He hasn't had a lot of military experience, so he chooses as his chief of staff a very experienced soldier. Would you like to guess who that soldier is? Tiberius Julius Alexander is the chief of staff. He is the brains behind the Roman conquest of Jerusalem. How strange does it get? We are told in Josephus that he tries to persuade Titus not to destroy the temple. After all, his father has dedicated 9 gold and silver doors to the temple. And Titus, according to Josephus, agrees, but the situation gets out of hand. If we're to believe Josephus, Titus has nothing to do with it. I tend to think Titus wanted plausible deniability, and he knew perfectly well that the soldiers would run amok and the temple would be destroyed. And Tiberius Julius Alexander is undoubtedly present in Rome for the triumph that follows this. The evidence suggests, though not making absolutely certain, that he ends his life as a Roman senator. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead now. I'm going to spin ahead to the year 116. In the year 116, there's a new emperor in Rome. There have been many new emperors. This one is Trajan. You've probably heard of Trajan. Not a friend of the Jewish people. His father, also named Trajan, had been one of Vespasian's chief lieutenants in suppressing the revolt in Judea. And Trajan wants to keep a lid on Jewish unrest in the Eastern Mediterranean. There's unrest in Judea because the Jews want to rebuild the temple and want to rebuild Jerusalem, and the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and left it in ruins, and the temple in ruins after the first revolt. The Romans also imposed a humiliating tax on the Jews, the fiscus Judaicus. They made every Jew in the Roman Empire, wherever he lived, or whether he supported the revolt or not, pay a tax to the chief god of Rome, Jupiter of the Capitoline Hill, as if to make up for the 2 shekel tax that Jews had paid to the temple earlier. Trajan is really concerned about what the Jews think, because he has decided he is going to finally fulfill the Roman dream of conquering the Parthian Empire. He invades Armenia, he invades Adiabene, he invades Mesopotamia, and he makes it all the way south to the Persian Gulf. And the Senate declares him Parthicus, the conqueror of the Parthian Empire. But the Parthians, like modern Iraqis, are only stepping back in order to attack better in the future. Okay, so, and the Parthians have an ace up their sleeve. Their ace is the Jews. While the Romans are involved in this war, the Jews of the West revolt. They rise in revolt. They rise in revolt first in Cyrenaica, which is to say eastern Libya, northeastern Libya, and then in Egypt, and then in Cyprus. And these are very serious rebellions. How can the Jews do it, you might ask? What military experience do they have? They have quite a lot. So in Egypt, Jews had served the Ptolemies and then the Romans in the army. There are Jewish military colonies in Egypt. Jews are also involved in patrolling the Nile Delta. They are sailors who patrol the Nile Delta and keep it safe. In Libya, there had also been Jewish military colonies and Jewish soldiers. Those colonies probably had been dissolved when the Romans conquered Libya, but there are people who have family traditions and know something about warfare. And they rise in revolt in these 2 places, and also in Cyprus, where there's a large Jewish community. By the same time, the Jews of Mesopotamia are spearheading the resistance to the Romans. They're helping the Parthians. Was this coordinated? Is the Parthian Empire, are the Iranians asking the Jews to help them fight the Romans? I think so, but I can't prove it. The reason I think so is for a couple of reasons. One, setting up proxy wars is exactly how the Iranians worked in antiquity. It's nothing new. It's exactly how they worked. In the 5th century BC, when the Greeks are threatening the Persian Empire, an earlier Iranian empire, the Iranians buy friendly Greeks to turn on each other and make life easier for Iran. Likewise, when Alexander the Great attacks the Persian Empire, the Persians get a Greek general to set up a Greek fleet to invade Greece and set up a revolt in the rear to force Alexander to turn back. It doesn't work because the general dies suddenly. There's a wonderful novel that suggests he was poisoned at Aristotle's behest. Probably he had a stroke or a heart attack. But this is the Iranian way of war in antiquity. It's absolutely nothing new. We know that there were Iranian ambassadors working in the West. We know the Iranians were encouraging the Dacians, that is to say the Romanians, to revolt against the Romans. We also know there's substantial contact between the Jews of the East and the Jews of the West. And we know that people in the ancient world, even though they dressed funny and ran around in robes, were actually very sophisticated and had lots of communications. So I would be really surprised if it's just an accident that the Jews in the West happen to revolt when the Roman Empire is at its weakest and is attacking their one friend in the ancient world, the Parthian Empire. Trajan is forced to take part of his army and send it to the West to suppress the revolt in Egypt, Libya, and Cyprus. He does so very successfully. Unfortunately, he more or less wipes out the Jewish community in all three of those places. He has another general, a man named Lucius Quietus, in Latin, Kitos, in Hebrew, hence the word Kitos War. Lucius Quietus suppresses the Jewish revolts in Mesopotamia, and then he sent westward to Judea to be the governor of Judea, and he suppresses, he puts down, there's disturbances there, probably riots, but he puts those down with an iron fist, and it doesn't become a full-scale revolt there either. People I want to introduce you to. The leaders of the revolt in the West. In Cyrenaica, the leader is a man named Lucuas, sometimes referred to as Andreas. We don't know if these are two people or not, or one guy with two names, which is not unusual. Lucuas is followed as, he's treated as a king by his people. We get this in Greek, and it's quite interesting because Josephus often says that someone's treated by a king as a way to explain to Greek readers the concept of a Messiah, that this is the King Messiah. Likewise, there's a man in Cyprus named Artemion, another Greek name. Artemion is the leader of the rebellion in Cyprus. We're not sure if he's treated as a Messiah as well, but it's certainly possible that he was. Two other people I want to introduce you to. Pappus and Lollianus. Has anyone heard of Pappus and Lollianus? Can you tell us who they were?
No.
But you've heard of them. Okay, you're halfway there. So Pappus and Lollianus are two wealthy Jews who live in Syria probably, and they want to help Jews who want to go back to the land of Israel. And we believe that the ambition, the goal of these rebels in the West, besides getting rid of the hated tax, was to go back to the land of Israel and rebuild the temple. And Pappus and Lollianus want to help them. They're wealthy, they have resources to help them make their way back to Israel. They are captured by Lucius Quietus, they are tortured, and they are executed. They're treated as martyrs. And for centuries, the day of their martyrdom, the 12th of Adar, is a fast day in the Jewish calendar. It no longer is, I don't know why not, but it was in those times. So I think what's so interesting about this war is the connection between the Jews, the rebels in the land of Israel, and also further west, and the Jews of Mesopotamia and the Parthian Empire. They seem to be working in tandem against the Romans. It was something the Jews wanted in the Great Revolt. Josephus tells us they wanted to get help from Parthia, and they did get some help from the descendants of Helen of Adiabene, probably her grandsons, and some other people from Adiabene, where they are fighting in the Great Revolt, fighting against the Romans. Some of them are captured by the Romans in the end, and they are taken off to Rome as hostages, bargaining chips in Roman-Parthian relations. It becomes even clearer in this second war, in the diaspora war, in the Kitos War. And I also think it plays a great role in what happens next, in the Bar Kokhba revolt and the coming of the Bar Kokhba revolt. But maybe we should leave this for the next part of our program, and I'll just stop here.
Okay. Professor Strauss, thank you very much for the amazing introduction, there's so much in the book, and obviously you nicely touched on, I think, some things that people wouldn't know. I think that was really it's a teaser to get the book and read the full history. I wanted to ask, because I assume I'm speaking not just for myself when I say that it's not an area, it's not a part of Jewish history that many of us have spent a lot of time studying, know too much about. And as you mentioned, the Romans conquered Judea in 63 BCE,
Yeah.
and put an end to this period of Jewish independence. And then there's a long period before we get to the Great Revolt, right? More than 100 years.
Yes.
So one of my questions, I know you mentioned Shakespeare. I want to refer to another great British contribution to culture, Monty Python. Life of Brian, right? Has everyone seen Life of Brian? Yes? Many? Some people? Okay. Monty Python's Life of Brian. What have the Romans ever done for us? That's, I think some people... So there's, you know, I don't want to talk too much about Monty Python, but the idea that there were, up to that point, this question of to what extent were the Jews content under Roman rule? Were they accepting? Were they grudgingly accepting? Did they actually appreciate some of the advances made under? What was it like to, you know, if you take us back, to be a Jew in Judea under Roman rule? How intrusive was the Roman presence? If you're walking the streets of Jerusalem, did you see centurions on the street? Did you feel the Roman presence here?
Thanks. Great questions. So yeah, it is over a century before the Great Revolt happens. There are earlier revolts, and from the very beginning, there are some Jews in Judea who are bristling under Roman rule. Big surprise, Jews disagreed with each other. Some of them accepted Roman rule grudgingly. Some of them accepted Roman rule willingly, thinking, at last, we are part of the global community. You know, we are part of this empire. And some thought of the Romans as satanic, who had to be opposed, the evil empire. This is a period in Jewish history of the height of messianic and apocalyptic thought. So the golden age of apocalypse is between around 200 BCE and 200 CE. And there are many people in the Jewish world, and then later in the Christian world, who are thinking in terms of apocalypse, that the end of days is coming, that the Romans are the harbinger of the end of days, and that the Messiah is going to come and redeem Israel. There's elements of this in the...
Okay. We all got the same.
We've all received the message that there might be a missile heading our way from the Houthis.
We'll wait for the next.
Yeah, well, let me just say, if there is a siren, we will head downstairs to the auditorium, which functions also as our mama.
No, not my first. But to all my friends in the United States, don't worry.
I assume perhaps a response to the to Israel's act. They can't take a joke though. Anyway, you were saying let's wait and see if there is in fact a siren, and then we'll
Okay, so okay, so
wait a second.
Supposed to be also in Jerusalem.
Okay, so we went so
The next few minutes.
okay. Right, listen, if the siren goes, we'll head down, and then we'll join the soldiers. We'll stay there for 10 minutes and then come back up here to resume. But I think maybe we'll continue until we hear the actual siren. Exactly.
Okay. So the Essenes and Qumran are opposed to the Romans from the word go. And as early as 47 BCE, there is a Jew named Hezekiah who raids over the border into Syria.
Here we go. All right. Yeah. For those watching on Zoom, we have a siren here in Jerusalem. We will resume in about 10 minutes. The seats again. I hope we haven't lost any of our Zoom audience. Apologies for that. You can thank our friends in Yemen for that brief interruption.
As long as it's not the Romans.
Right, it was not the Romans. Not the Romans.
They'll go the way of the Romans. That's been the history.
Bezrat Hashem. Okay. All right. If people take their seats, Professor Strauss, if you'd like to continue. Sorry.
I'm just married to you. It doesn't matter. Leave me aside.
Okay, so we do this a lot. So this guy Hezekiah is attacking Roman towns in Syria over the border, and the Romans send an enforcer up there to capture him, to neutralize him. It's young Herod. Herod's not king yet, and he captures Hezekiah, kills him and some of his followers without a trial. And the widows and mothers of the dead protest in Jerusalem. Herod is brought before the Sanhedrin, put on trial for what he did. Normally, people who are brought, defendants brought before the Sanhedrin, dressed in black, in sackcloth, ashes, begging for mercy. He comes in royal robes with a bodyguard. He makes the point, and he is acquitted. This is like a mafioso coming with his capiregime. So the guy gets acquitted, and he goes on to bigger and worse things. When Herod dies, there is a rebellion. He has killed his most competent sons because he considers them a threat, which they probably were. And there's a rebellion and against the son he's left in power. It could have become a very serious revolt, except the Romans have a very competent governor in Syria, a man named Varus, Quintilius Varus, who hurries into Judea, puts down the rebellion, and we're told that he executes the most guilty of the rebels from Roman point of view by crucifying them, 2,000 men, and maybe some women too, we don't know, who he crucifies around the walls of Jerusalem. Then in the year 6 CE, the son of Herod, who is governing central Israel, he messes up in various ways. And Augustus, the emperor, pulls the plug on him and makes Judea a Roman province. And now that it's a Roman province, they have to pay taxes. And so they institute a census. This leads to a new revolt, a tax revolt. The leader of the revolt is a man named Judah, son of Hezekiah. Some people think he is descended from this first Hezekiah. This revolt is very, and he has the support of a priest named Zadok. They are forming, or Judah is forming a dynasty of rebels. Ultimately, it's probably his grandson who is the leader of the rebels at Masada. So there are plenty of Jews who are unhappy with the Romans. There are also a series of figures who pop up, Messiah figures, some of them, who want to lead rebellions against the Romans. The most famous Messiah figure, of course, is Jesus of Nazareth, who I think was probably a spiritual rebel rather than a political rebel. But he engages in a gesture of great defiance to Rome. He goes to Jerusalem in the season of Passover, in the season of Pesach. And that is the traditional time of rebellion, because Pesach, of course, is the festival of freedom. And the Romans are not blind to this. You asked if you would have seen a Roman presence in Jerusalem. Yes, you would have. The Romans do not have a legion in Judea because Judea is absolutely a B or C province from the Romans' point of view. It's not even a province. It's a region of the province of Syria. The Romans govern it with auxiliary troops, as they're called, non-Roman citizens, locals. Mostly these guys are Samaritans and Greeks who live in Judea, and they don't like the Jews. So they're the ones who are serving, in effect, as the priest. They're the ones who are parading as soldiers, and they're the ones who who I think, in various instances, we know they do, they rub the Jews living there the wrong way.
The not so good Samaritans.
The not so good Samaritans.
One of the things that comes out of the book is this the complexities of the inner Jewish conversation, the inner Jewish debate.
Yes.
And we know, of course, both in the context of the Great Revolt and also, of course, for Kochba, that you have there's a lot of Jew versus Jew. It's not just Jew versus Rome.
Definitely.
Can you speak to that a little bit and the implications for that, for whether that was ultimately helpful for the Romans?
Oh, yes, it's certainly helpful for the Romans. So, some of the scholars who've written about this, particularly my colleague, Jonathan Bryce at Tel Aviv University, have pointed out that this was a Jewish civil war as much as it was a war of the Jews versus Rome. As you know, there are various different groups in the Jewish population at this time. I've mentioned the Essenes, probably the people at Qumran. Within Jerusalem, there are zealots who are priests who model themselves after Pinchas in the Torah. They want to be extra zealous in defense of Judaism, and in their case, in opposition to the Romans. There are also the so-called Sicaries. These are the dagger men, hitmen, assassins, and they're probably associated with this dynasty that rebelled against Rome earlier on. And they are attacking not just Romans, they're attacking and killing Jews in Judea, people who they think are insufficiently opposed to the Romans or who are collaborators with the Romans.
Is the opposition to Rome by the Zealots and by others a religious opposition in the sense that the Romans are pagans desecrating the sanctity of Jerusalem?
I mean, absolutely, yes, but so in this period, there is a very fine line between religion and politics, and you can't really talk about one without the other. So from the Jewish point of view, Judea is the Holy Land, it's Eretz Yisrael, and it is governed from Jerusalem. It's governed from the Beit HaMikdash. It's governed from the temple, which is the house of God. That's the government of Judea. From the Roman point of view, Judea is a Roman possession, and it is governed from Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea, Caesar city by the sea. And this is a city built by Herod. It's meant to look like a Roman city. It is crowned by a temple to Augustus. It has got a hippodrome, which could also double as an amphitheater. Every 4 years, it puts on games in honor of the Battle of Actium, gladiatorial games. Herod even has gladiatorial games in Jerusalem. And he builds another city in favor of Augustus, Sebaste, Nablus, or outside of Nablus. Sebaste means Augusta in Greek. And finally, another temple to Augustus on the road to Damascus, near the foot of Mount Hermon. From their point of view, it's a Roman province. And the only way to keep this place from blowing up into revolt is somehow having a balance between the two sides. Herod and some others are able to keep this balance going, but it's more difficult to do it when you've got the Romans misbehaving, and the Romans misbehaved massively in the lead up to the Great Revolt.
In the book, you write about in the conclusion of the book, you talk about perhaps, or you pose the question, I think, that perhaps the real heroes at the end of the story are the rabbis who keep Judaism going, effectively. But then you pose a very interesting question, which I think is very thought-provoking, which is, did the rabbis have to live through the rebellion in order to get to that point, in order to reach that conclusion? When you've done all the research, you've studied the sources, you've been thinking about this for a long time, what conclusion do you reach about the relative merits of the rebellion against the Romans? Something as important as something that brought together the Jewish people, created this sense of national pride, national feeling, but ultimately futile against the greatest power on earth at the time. What's your feeling about it?
So it's a great question. and many historians have wrestled with this, and I think really good historians have just disagreed about what the legacy of the revolt is. There are some who say this was madness, it was folly, it was evil to subject the Jewish people to the disaster that the revolt represented. And if there only had not been the revolt, then we would have stayed in our land permanently, and we would have survived and be here to the present day, and there never would have been the exile, and it all would have been okay. Or at least there wouldn't have been so many Jews killed and enslaved. But there are others who'd say, that's a nice dream, but that's not what would have happened. If the Jews had stayed here, they would have slowly assimilated to the Roman way. The Romans would have pecked at them little by little over the years.
As happened elsewhere. Right?
As happened elsewhere. You know, the other peoples of the Roman Empire,
right.
I mean, they still live, many of them where they did in antiquity, but they don't have the same religions. They don't have the same customs that they did in antiquity. Those who defend the revolt say they were motivated. Some of them, of course, were corrupt. Some of them had less than pure motives, but on the whole, they were motivated by a spiritual desire to preserve the Jewish way of life. And the revolt lit fires in people's souls, even though it killed so many people. And maybe it was the example set by the rebels that taught the rabbis, look, we can't fight the Romans anymore physically, but we must fight them spiritually. And so I think, in my opinion, the rebels and the rabbis have this in common. They both have this determination to preserve the Jewish way of life against this very powerful empire, even if it meant accepting the inevitability of the rule of the empire. Spiritual resistance continued, and I think the rebels set an example of spiritual resistance.
Yeah, and of course the rebels, even if they themselves, it was futile against the Romans, they set an example in many respects some 2,000 years later.
Yes.
For a successful revolt here.
Yeah.
Against the British Empire.
Yeah.
and I think the great Zionists of the time explicitly refer back to Bar Kokhba and others.
Absolutely, they inspired many people of Zionism.
Right. Okay, I'm going to open the floor to your questions. So we already had a hand shoot up. So, gentlemen here.
Yeah, I have one question. You talk mostly about political and military opposition. Was there, even like today, the Jewish community worldwide as facing this fear, and anti-Semitism, we've been through a whole century. Was there a fear of Jewish thought in Rome, Jewish thought, and which ended even in Christianity, which changed and in a sense defeated the Roman Empire? Was there a fear of growing influence of Jewish thought and philosophy and religion within the thing that caused certain
the Romans themselves were somehow inspired to hate the Jews because of they saw the Jews as a threat? Is that?
You know, the things that we even have all through Jewish history, we have unexplainable things of why people have been influenced and have fear, I think, of us.
I mean, you said that the Jews, there was a specific tax against the Jews and only the Jews.
That's right, but that was after the revolt. Right. I think the Romans did not appreciate Judaism, the Jewish way of life.
But
that's very clear.
Inside Rome, forces that may have threatened the Roman Empire from inside.
I think it's more that the Romans were threatened by anyone who represented countervailing power to Rome. And the fact that the Jews are in so many different places in the empire, that in many ways they have loyalty to Jerusalem and not to Rome. They don't worship the emperor. Once you have the emperors, everybody has to worship the emperor except the Jews. But even more than that, the fact that there's the Jewish community extends into the Parthian Empire. And this constant interchange between the Jews of the Parthian Empire, the Jews of the Roman Empire, and some Jews openly are pro-Parthian. That bothers the Romans a lot. So I think that was more important. From the Roman point of view, I won't deny that there was a spiritual challenge in Judaism, but I think it was more the political challenge of Judaism that bothered the Romans.
Can I, while people are contemplating their questions, can I just piggyback on that and ask, were there obvious objective reasons why the Jews would prefer to live under Parthian than?
Absolutely, yes. So first of all, there's a long history of good relations between the Iranians and the Jews.
Right.
There's a previous empire, it's called the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The founder of that is Cyrus the Great, and Cyrus famously allows the Jews to go back to Judea from Babylonian captivity. On top of that, there's a certain cultural affinity. So the Jews are monotheists, of course, and the Iranians are not, but they are henotheists. That is to say, they tend to focus on one God rather than saying there's only one God. Zoroastrianism, there are some similarities, or at least similarities, wrong for connections between Zoroastrianism and Judaism. They fit together better than Greco-Roman paganism and Judaism do.
Okay. Any other questions that people may have? Yes.
Which faction would you have joined in?
If the Zoom audience didn't hear that,
In the 60s of Jerusalem.
which faction would you have joined?
I would like to think I would have joined the rebels. I would not have been a Sicarii. The Sicarii weren't in Jerusalem anymore. They were kicked out at the beginning of the revolt because they had misbehaved and assassinated a zealot leader. And they were assassinated in their leader was assassinated in turn, and they fled to Masada. Might have been a zealot. I might have followed. I like Simon Bar Giora, who was one leader of the revolt. John of Giscala was pretty good as well. So one of those two guys, I think I would have been fighting there against the Romans. That's how I'd like to see myself, crazy as that sounds.
Okay, you can all picture that. Yes, sir.
The revolt of around year 116.
Yes.
I'm wholly unfamiliar with them until hearing from you.
Right.
Is this not covered in Judaic sources like the Talmud?
There's a great question. There's almost nothing in the Talmud about these sources. So there are other scholars who've done absolutely heroic work in putting the sources together, particularly someone named Miriam Pucci Ben-Zeev. She's done a series of studies that are really fundamental, and I've depended on those. We get information about this from the Greco-Roman sources, from the church fathers, and there is a fair amount of papyrus documentation of the revolt from Egypt. So we get a certain amount of it from those sources, but very little from the Jewish sources. A little bit, but not much. And so, although the Bar Kokhba revolt is also a detective story, this is even more so.
Of course, the source that so many of us are familiar with for a lot of this, albeit not for the diaspora revolt, is Josephus.
Yes.
And I'm interested because you mentioned it before. You mentioned him before. Josephus, there's, the jury's out, right? Is he the traitor who abandoned his people for the Romans? Is he the heroic Jewish historian who actually wanted to keep alive the Jewish memory and Jewish history? How should we think of Josephus, and also how reliable should we treat his writings?
So, yeah, great question. The answer is both. I mean, Josephus is a very complicated guy. He really is. He's a wonderful writer. He's a fantastic storyteller. As a historian, he's not the best. And he sometimes he wants to put himself in the best possible light. Doesn't always work. And also, he writes the Jewish War probably around the year 75, as the time is finished. About 20 years later, he publishes the Antiquities of the Jews, this really incredible work meant to be the history of the world from the creation to just before the Great Revolt. And then a kind of a postscript to it is called his life. And the story he tells in the life is a different story of what he did in the Great Revolt. So it's a real problem for historians. We try to reconcile the two. We can't always do so. He is a traitor. There's no doubt about it. But he's also a guy who devotes the rest of his life to trying to justify the Jewish people and to write books to oppose anti-Semites, which he does, and to try to justify the Jewish people in the eyes of the Roman audience. He probably writes the Jewish war first in Aramaic, it seems. We're not 100% sure, but the version we have is in Greek. And so he's writing partly a Jewish audience because the Jews of the Eastern Mediterranean speak Greek, many of them, outside of the land, outside of Judea, but also to a Greek-speaking audience. And his message to the Jews is, don't mess with the Romans, they're brutes, don't do it again. His message to the rest of the world is the Jews are actually heroic people. They didn't mean to rebel against Rome. They only rebelled because of a few bad apples, these zealots and Sicarii, who dragged them into the revolt. But ordinary Jews were good and loyal subjects to Rome, and they always will.
And he was living in Rome.
He was living in Rome.
Do we know that? Do we think that he was an observant Jew at this point? Whatever that meant at the time.
I think he was, because there is a lot of Torah in his work. He goes to great pains to say, I did not defect to the Romans to save my life. I defected to the Romans because Hashem told me to do so. He gave me a dream and said that Rome is now going to be in charge. God has decided to punish the Jewish people, to give the rule to Rome, and the right thing to do is to be on the side of the Romans. I think he meant it. There are other indications in his work that he takes religion seriously. So, yeah.
Okay. Yes, at the back.
You mentioned that Jesus showed opposition to the Romans by coming to Jerusalem during the Passover.
Yeah.
But I feel like most Jews, that's like what they didn't like about Jesus. They didn't like show enough opposition to the Romans. Like, what makes you say that he was like trying to show active opposition?
Well, I mean, I think he must have known that the Romans were especially alert to Jewish resistance during the Passover season. They sent a garrison to Jerusalem. The governor, Pontius Pilate, went to Jerusalem for Passover. They were on the lookout, and they were every year, for possible Jewish acts of resistance during that time. So Jesus comes to Jerusalem. If we believe the Gospels, he is greeted as the Messiah by his followers, that is to say, a king, not something the Romans are going to like. And he goes to the temple and he overturns some of the shops there. He overturns the tables of the money changers, and I believe money changers at any rate. And he says the temple is going to be destroyed and it's all going to be replaced. His message is also that the end is coming. The end of days is coming, which doesn't sound so good for the Roman rule. But he's not advocating violent resistance to Rome. He runs afoul of the priesthood, of the priests, if we believe the Gospels. If we believe the book of John, the Gospel of John says there are priests who thought Jesus has to be eliminated because he makes us look bad before the Romans, and he's threatening the entire Jewish people by what he's doing. I don't think it would have taken very much to convince the governor. You got a troublemaker? Gotta go.
But he was Jewish.
He was Jewish, yes, he was Jewish. There were so many Jewish troublemakers who the governors had. There's so many Jewish troublemakers who the governors had executed that this was just another one from their point of view. At least that's how I read it.
You mentioned that when Herod died, the Romans took over after his son was moved from power, and then there was the tax, and that's one of the reasons. But how harshly did Herod tax the Jews in Judea? Do we know anything? Or did he tax them? How harshly? And did he pass on tribute to Rome from what?
He did tax the Jews in Judea, but he didn't have to pay tribute to Rome, not directly. But he was a loyal vassal. He supported the Romans in various ways. But he did tax them. However, they were being taxed by a Jew, or at least, he was of Idumean descent, and his mother was an Arab, so he was sneered at as a half-Jew by some. But he was a Jew. So yes, he did tax them. The trouble is the Romans are foreigners who are imposing this census, and the tax is going to come from abroad. So that really rubs people the wrong way.
Do you have a question?
Bit of a update. Having read all this history, written some of it,
Right.
here we are trying to seek independence
Right.
among the powers, and the interplay between them.
Right.
Would you have a piece of advice for current Zionists? What are conclusions? How do you go about defending your independence without going off into tandems which might be disturbing?
You know, I'm not an Israeli, so I'm just a foreign troublemaker. I would just say that Israel is, as it was, a small state among great powers. And Israel should be very proud of what it has achieved and the strength that it has. But it should also remember it is not omnipotent. And that it depends to a certain extent on the kindness of strangers. So I think Israel has to remember that, and also remember that it's not in Scandinavia and it's not in North America. It's in the Middle East. It's part of the region, and it always has to take that into account. I don't think any Israeli needs me to tell them that.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Okay. Let me just let me ask one conclusion.
Sure, absolutely.
Question, and then we'll conclude. You mentioned in your talk about how Israel then and now has had one foot in the west, one foot in the east.
Yes.
Which is certainly the case today in all kinds of ways. And then, as you said, there was Rome to the west, there was Parthia to the east. What do you think was the significance of that then for the way Rome saw the Jews and the way that maybe the Jews saw themselves?
Yeah. Great question. I mean, I think the Romans thought the Jews could be very useful, but also very dangerous because they have, in a sense, dual loyalties. There is this big, important Jewish community in the Parthian Empire, and they are Rome's hereditary enemy, or well on the way to becoming so. And I think for the Jews, for some, there are going to be temptations to look to the West, particularly with this large community in Egypt. And the community in Egypt speaks Greek. I'm not sure they could read the Torah in Hebrew. They have their own Greek translation, the Septuagint. So they're quite different. Whereas the community to the east, they speak Aramaic, a different dialect of Aramaic than the one spoken in Judea, but nonetheless comprehensible. They could communicate. And I think that there are certainly some Jews who look eastward. In the 40s, or in the 40s and 30s of the last century BCE, there's a civil war in Judea, with some people choosing the Romans and some people choosing the Parthians. And there are always some Jews who are looking eastward and thinking Rome is the problem we have to deal with. But if only the Parthians can come in and help us, then we can escape this. And the Romans are saying, Judea is part of our empire, but we can't trust these people, and they might go over to the Parthians. So I think Parthia is casting a shadow over this drama in very big ways.
Okay. Professor Bryce Strauss, I think that history, we're often taught that history repeats itself, maybe not as sometimes as a tragedy or farce, but so that we can learn from history. I think it was Charles Krapham who said that the Jewish people are the only people who still inhabit the same land, speak the same language, worship the same God and observe the same customs as they did 2,000 years ago. And that continuum, I think, means that the Jewish history, perhaps even more than other history, is worth reading about, learning from, and that we can still learn so much of relevance for today, and certainly so much that's inspiring and insightful for us as Jews today. And you've contributed extraordinarily to that with this book. So thank you so much, Bryce Strauss, for the book. And for joining us this evening in Jerusalem. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for watching on Zoom. I repeat, the book is available in good bookstores everywhere, but also on Amazon. So please do get it. Jews versus Rome by Bryce Strauss.
And for those of you who are new to the Vega Center, you can come again to our English events, also our Hebrew events, you can speak Hebrew. If you're not on our mailing list, you can email me, Paul G, at vegancenter.org.il. Get on the mailing list. Otherwise, check out our website or see us on Facebook. Thank you very much. Good night.
This was